My name is Bryce Bigham, and I am the Director of Development and Marketing at Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm here today with Dr. Sam Waldron, who's the President of Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary, also the Professor of Systematic Theology, and my pastor as well, pastor of Grace Reformed Baptist Church in Owensboro, Kentucky.
All those things.
That's right. That's right. I've invited him here to tell us just a little bit about our conference that we have coming up in March of 2022. Dr. Waldron, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome, sir.
Now, the first thing I want to talk about is you're teaching a class in a couple weeks. Is that right?
That's right. I'm looking forward to teaching our basic course on eschatology.
All right, and we're looking forward to that. My first question for you is, would you tell us a little bit about the conference that's coming up that CBTS is hosting?
Well, it's our first conference. We've been thinking about doing this for some time, but it's our first conference. And we'll be hosting it at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. And it'll be held March 17 to 19. That's a Thursday, Friday, and Saturday.
All right. And now, what is behind the theme, I Will Build My Church?
Well, beside the fact that I'll be preaching on that subject, or that text, it's also related to the fact that we're strongly committed to the whole issue of church planning and missions, and we're committed to it because it's a direct outgrowth of this great promise to His church that Christ has given us, the optimism of that is contained in the promise, I will build my church in Matthew 16.
Now, why is CBTS doing a conference on missions and church planning?
Well, great question. I guess for me, it goes back to conversations I've had with Paul Washer. We've had a number of conversations on the phone about the whole issue of missions, and we found ourselves to be very much with both the same heart and the same theology of missions. And I thought it would be a great idea to have Paul present his studies on the theology of missions. Of course, he's the president of Heart Cry and strongly committed to missions in that way, but also has been doing a lot of study to develop and hone his own theology of missions over the last few years. And we found ourselves with a deep level of agreement about this subject.
I know it's exciting. We're really excited for this coming up in March. What about, you mentioned Paul Washer. Who are some of the other speakers, and what are some of the subjects they're going to be talking about?
Well, besides Paul speaking on a theology of missions, I'll be doing a couple of sermons, one on I Will Build My Church, another on the whole subject of church planning and why I think every pastor should be a church planner and be interested in church planning and missions. And then John Miller will be speaking on church planning from the perspective of one who's been the guy on the ground and having to go in and plant a church from scratch, which he has done. And we're looking forward to hearing from him as his speaking will be informed about his own experience on this subject. And then Tom Nettles is going to be there speaking a couple of times on church planning and missions in Baptist history. And we're looking forward to hearing from him and having the perspectives of Baptist church history on this subject. And who better to speak on that than Dr. Tom Nettles?
Yeah, those sound like really, really helpful topics. Now, how would you convince our listeners who are listening to this video to come to the conference?
You know, I was asked a number of years ago to speak about church planning. And my first reaction was, well, I'm not the typical church planner, and I don't really think of myself as a church planner. I'm a pastor, I'm a theologian, a teacher, but a church planner. But then as I look back on my experience, I realized that as a part of a team of elders in the Reformed Baptist Church of Grand Rapids back in the 1980s and 90s, and then in other places where I've been a pastor, I've always been involved in church planning. And so it's my conviction that every pastor, even pastors like me that don't think of it as their first or primary calling or gift, ought to be involved in church planning, because churches are planted by churches and ought to be planted by churches and their elderships. And it's a church with an eldership, a plurality of elders that is in the best position to plant churches and to do missions. And so I think that everyone who aspires to be a pastor, everyone who is a pastor and is thinking about what God's call is in his life with regard to church planting and missions ought to be interested, highly interested in this conference.
Yeah, it seems like something that is not just for those who want to be missionaries or church planters, but doesn't the whole church as well need to have some basic understanding of missions and church planting biblically?
That's right. It's not just pastors. It's not just, let me back up and say, it's not just the guy who feels like he's called to church planting or being a missionary. It's all pastors, and then it's the whole church that ought to be interested in following Christ's call to gather with him and not to scatter.
Yeah. Well, we do hope that you'll join us for our first annual Covenant Conference in Louisville, Kentucky on March 17th through the 19th of 2022. We look forward to hearing from Paul Washer, Tom Nettles, Sam Waldron, as well as Pastor John Miller on the subject of missions and church planting. Registration is open now. You should be aware that prices do increase on Christmas Day, so I encourage you to go ahead and take a look at that registration page and get registered if you're interested in coming. To learn more or register, you can visit covcon.org. That's covcon.org. Thanks for listening.